All right, we're sitting down with Congressman Bill Johnson. Thanks. It's been a while since we've seen you, but thanks for stopping in studio with us. Wanted to talk what was in the news in the past 24 hours, past day or so, and that is President Trump and his administration going on the recommendation of Wilbur Ross, at least to impose some sort of tariff. He did signal yesterday that he wanted to impose those. What was your initial reaction when you heard that President Trump was moving to impose a 25% tariff on foreign steel?
Well, I'm not surprised that the president is moving. I certainly wasn't anticipating that decision. I was at the White House week before last when the president met with members of the Senate and the House to talk about the 232 investigations that were going on steel dumping and aluminum dumping here in America, predominantly from China. And we cautioned then the president to understand the balance. You know, we want to protect our indigenous capability, our producers here at home to produce steel, to produce aluminum, but at the same time, we've got to be very, very careful that we don't get into these trade wars because tariffs don't always work. You remember Bush, President Bush did that during his administration, and the countries that were subject to those tariffs just simply shifted the cost of goods that weren't covered by the tariffs, and it was a balancing issue on their general ledger, and it didn't hurt them at all, but it hurt Americans. So we've got to be very careful, and the president at that time led us to believe that he understood that balance to manage production here at home, but at the same time keep countries like China and Russia from taking advantage of American workers by dumping counterfeit goods here, steel, aluminum, etc. So haven't seen the details of what the president is actually going to do. I've heard the announcement. We'll see how this goes as it moves forward, because we've got some certain sectors of our steel industry that have to have the help. For example, AK Steel is the only steel company in America that manufactures what's called electrical steel, the kind of steel that makes electric transformers that keep our electric grid functioning. The only other country in the world that does that is China. We certainly don't want to cede that manufacturing to an adversary on the economic and military spectrum.
Barring any details, it seemed to be a blanket 25% proposal on steel and then the 10% on aluminum. If that were to move forward, would you support that, or if it would be bounced back to Congress for approval?
Well, I don't know that comes back to Congress for approval. And again, I'll have to look at the details of exactly what the president says. I don't know that there is such a thing as just a blanket. I mean, there's got to be products that are identified. There's got to be countries that are identified. So I got to look at the details when that comes out. I haven't seen the details of what the president's going to do.
One of the projects in the area, or one of the looming hopeful projects in the area, the proposed cracker plant in Belmont County, might be affected by that if we're to move forward. As a point to check in on that, what have you been hearing about the prospect of that project being a reality?
Well, I'm still hearing very, very positive things about that project. It seems to be moving in the right direction. Every indication that we have is that the analysis and design phase is still ongoing, and I see no reason yet, have seen no reason to believe that project is slowing down in its progress. But you're right, these tariffs could have an impact on that, because some of the steel that would be required to build that facility would come from overseas sources. Some of the steel would come from America, obviously, but some of it would come from overseas sources as well, because of the kinds of steel that we're talking about. So it is certainly part of that balance equation that the president's going to have to strike.
Of positive things, you wanted to talk about tax reform. This was, I think, the major GOP victory on the Hill this past year. What have you been hearing from constituents? What have you been hearing? What have you been seeing on the ground on why this was a success and a good thing for your constituents?
Oh my goodness, I think this is historic. You know, when Reagan did tax reform back in the 80s, he saw economic growth spike to 7.3% of GDP. A couple of years after his tax reforms or his tax cuts went into to place over a 7-year period, saw a 22% increase in wages for middle-class Americans, over a 10-year period, 14 million jobs created. It was a big, big deal. What we did last fall, December, was so much bigger than that, bringing the corporate tax rate down from 35% to 21%, giving small business owners, those who create over 60% of the jobs in America, an effective tax rate of 29% versus the 40% that they were taking. We've seen bonuses handed out to employees, whether it's Walmart, furniture stores, the like, all across our region. People are benefiting. Everywhere I go, people are saying, thank you for the tax reform package, because I'm bringing home more money in my checking account. I'm able to fix my car. I'm able to pay for child care. I'm able to put money aside to send my son or daughter to college. I'm able to start a new business line within my company. There has been so many positive aspects to this, and I just talked to some folks today here in Jefferson County that said the exact same thing.
You've been hearing positive feedback from your constituents on that. You've been hearing some concerns, though, in terms of infrastructure, where this is going to move the needle in Congress. Just here in Steubenville, we're hearing their repairs just for the drinking water system alone is going to be a $7 million loan, likely through the EPA. What are you hearing through your constituents, and what are you hearing with your colleagues on Congress on how to move the needle on roads, bridges, and water lines?
Sure. Infrastructure is one of the biggest conversations that we're having, the most frequent conversation that we're having. And you're right, people here in eastern and southeastern Ohio are very, very concerned about infrastructure because it's not just roads and bridges. It's things like water systems, sewer systems, broadband internet access, which is critically important to curing that urban-rural divide that exists. We got a lot of intellectual capital that's going to waste that's not being realized because young people can't get access to the internet across our region. Businesses, for example, will not come in to places within our district because they can't get access to the internet. The ethane cracker plant is going to launch a manufacturing renaissance here in eastern and southeastern Ohio because plastics and textiles use the raw material of ethylene and polyethylene that would come out of that facility. So you're going to see manufacturing come back. But a lot of places in our district, businesses can't start up because they can't get access to the internet for managing their customers and their suppliers. So infrastructure is a big deal. And I'm glad to hear that the president and his infrastructure plan has a total section of that plan dedicated to rural America, places like Appalachia and where we live here along the Ohio River. So water systems, flood systems, sewer systems, broadband internet, that is a very positive conversation that's going on too. I'm hopeful that we're going to see some real detail come out later this year. I think it would be great if we could have a plan in place before August, and then when we come back in September and October this fall, see some action on infrastructure. I think the American people want it. The people that I serve here in eastern and southeastern Ohio certainly want it, and I support it.
Supporting how to pay for it, how would this move forward? How would there be a legitimate way to allocate those things? I know the general blueprint out of the White House about $1 trillion proposal on various aspects, but moving forward, especially off these tax cuts, this tax reform, where are we going to find the money to pay for major projects like roads and bridges and water line and expanding broadband?
Well, keep in mind what I told you about President Reagan's tax cuts when he did it back in the 80s. 7.3% economic growth. If we get economic growth even up to the 2.5% rate, you're not going to see deficits materialize from the tax cut that we put in place back in December. And now we're seeing projections that economic growth is already projected this year to be upwards of 5%. That's more than double what we need to offset the deficit. So we're growing the economy. Investments are coming. And we're going to see more money in the coffer to pay for these kinds of things. But part of the president's plan is public-private partnerships. partly private sector innovation. Look at what's happened in the space arena, for example, with SpaceX and Elon Musk, with private capital, his own money, developing a space platform and a rocket that can be reused at a fraction of the cost of the old NASA systems, where we had to discard and start over again with each and every launch. So private sector innovation, that's a heritage in America. When private investors are allowed to dream and to build big projects like this, you're going to see a lot of private sector innovation in the infrastructure arena too. So I am hopeful that states and local governments and private venture companies are going to come to the table to help find creative ways to pay for this trillion and a half dollar infrastructure plan that the president's talking about. It's not going to all come from taxpayer dollars.
I want to talk something else that the president was talking about, and that's gun control. We just had another shooting at a school, this time at a college at Central Michigan, and it's been in the conversation for several weeks now. I'm going to mention the president because it seems like the immigration live streamed and broadcast roundtables, that the rhetoric seems to be all over the place in terms of messaging what direction to go with gun control. The president said, perhaps in a gaffe or perhaps in just openly pontificating, said, quote, "We should grab the guns first and then worry about due process later." That setting up, he met with the NRA last night. Where do you see this going, especially with the Senate leadership, Mitch McConnell saying we're not going to take up any where they're going to move toward prioritizing a banking bill next week. With all that in the conversation, where should Congress be addressing this, if at all, this ongoing, emergent, revisited conversation about gun safety and mass murder violence in America?
Gun safety is one thing. Gun control is certainly something else. And that's where we need to draw the distinction. First of all, let me tell you, as a father, as a grandfather, my heart breaks for the victims of the shootings down in Parkland, Florida, as it has with all of the school shootings that we've had throughout our history. I'm a product of a public school. My children are products of a public school education. I don't want to send my kids to school and have to worry about their safety. I don't want my children, and I don't want any Americans to have to worry about the safety of their kids or their children to be concerned when they're at school. This is a comprehensive discussion that we've got to have. There were a lot of breakdowns in Parkland, Florida. There were a lot of red flags that went up. I mean, it's one thing to, the cliche-ish see something, say something, but if you see something and you say something and then you do nothing, that's a problem. How do we keep our children safe if we're not going to do something when the information raises its head? And on the other side of the fence, you've got the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens in this country to keep and bear arms. The oath of office that the president takes, that I take, every one of us takes, and the only swearing in that oath is to swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The most unambiguous statement in the Constitution, in my view, is the Second Amendment right of American citizens, that their rights to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So whatever we do, from a mental health perspective, from a safety perspective, from a cultural perspective, to keep firearms or weapons of destruction, whether it's a bomb, whether it's a truck, whatever that tool may be, out of the hands of mentally unstable people that want to do indiscriminate harm and kill innocent people. We've got to do that in the context of, what does the Constitution say? That document has served us well for 240 plus years. It's the underpinning of our system, and it's why America still stands guardian at the gate of freedom and carries the banner of liberty for the world. We've got to be careful how we go about this. There's a balance, but it's time for us to have that discussion.
taking the discussion back to, as you said, the constitutional and the Second Amendment, through the Keller decision of the Supreme Court, it construed the well-regulated militia component to be an individual right as well. Could that not be construed, for argument's sake, a well-regulated militia be a well-trained individual? Per the Parkland aspect, it seemed, as you said, many red flags. How he got access to guns is one thing, but how he gets them in any case. You're seeing corporations, Dick's, Walmart, pushing back on this, feeling the pressure of public opinion and raising the age of access of guns and munitions to 21. I don't know if that's something that Congress is going to consider, but what do you make of that emergent conversation about access to guns and gun safety when it comes to keeping guns in responsible hands as opposed to those who, someone who seemingly should not have had them and had many, as you said, many red flags, and law enforcement perhaps didn't have the legal tools to intervene? Is that a conversation that Congress could take up?
Well, I think law enforcement had the legal tools that they at their disposal to take action in this case. I think the FBI knows that. I think the Broward County Sheriff's Department knows that. I think the school system knows that. There were failures in this case that will begin to emerge as this investigation and the conversation continues on. But I think responsibility and accountability have to be a part of the discussion. Most states have a 21-year-old age to buy and consume alcohol, right? Most states have a 16-year-old age limit to drive an automobile. So we've already established in our system, in our society, that there are age limits for responsibility and accountability for certain things. And I think that discussion is a healthy discussion to have. But we've got to do it in a way that we don't infringe upon the law-abiding citizens' ability to keep and bear arms for self-defense. What do you do about the single mom, for example, 20 years old? She's not yet 21, that lives way out in the country, that's 20, 30 minutes from the phone call that would bring a law enforcement person to her aid if she felt that her or her children's lives were threatened. What do you say to her about her right to keep and bear arms? So there is a lot of discussion that has to happen around this topic before we start changing the law and putting laws in place that might infringe upon those constitutional rights. But we've got to make sure that America's children go to school with a sense of safety and security. I don't know why schools don't have a single point of entry. You know, I don't know why we're not doing that. There are other things that are just kind of common sense kinds of things that I think we need to take a strong look at too. Mental health is a big part of this.
I wanted to touch one more time on, we did a recent story about the AR-15 and how this is a touch point of the focus, how it's a conspicuous weapon. It's not something that you could conceal, as you mentioned, reasonably defending oneself at home or on your person. Do you think that is a realistic conversation to have when we start getting into the weapon itself, the tool itself, if you will, the focus on that? Do you think it's fair to focus on the AR-15 as it being the popular weapon of choice for these mass murder incidents where it's designed to maim and kill with efficiency versus a shotgun or a pistol or any other type of gun?
Well, I'm not saying that it's not a healthy conversation to have, because I think we need to have these conversations as a society. But I can tell you, I spent 26 and a half years in the Air Force. And in the Air Force, when we assess threats, we don't necessarily start with looking at the tool that would be used to exercise that threat. We look at who is the threat? How do we identify who that person is? And how do we put strategic plans in place to neutralize that threat? We talk about the tools at the very last. A person that has the mental instability to harm innocent people, wherever that is, whether it's at a school in Florida or a junior college in central Michigan that you told me about just a few minutes ago, or whether it's on the sidewalks in a crowded metropolitan city where people are out doing shopping. What is the tool? Is it a gun? Is it a bomb? Is it a car? Is it a truck? Is it a knife? And if we start going down that road to eliminate and start regulating and controlling the tools, where does that end? Responsibility, accountability, identifying those that have mental health issues that should not have access to those tools. That's where identifying the threat and preventing this really has to take place.
You mentioned mental health. I didn't want to get I didn't want that to get lost in here. Coupling that with the Parkland incident, it seems that you say see something, say something cliche. Well, if all that's in place, it seems that mental health may be on the back end of this. If someone would have said something or reacted properly, I guess let me ask you this: is there going to have to be a culture change with all these ideas in terms of catching something in the process and alerting it to the correct authorities? Couple with that the proposal to arm teachers. Right across the border in West Virginia, we're having an ongoing strike, and the responsibilities of teachers. So in terms of a culture change of seeing something, responding to something as you're seeing something develop, where do you see the culture change being in schools? Is it arming teachers? Is it setting up protocols where a troubled student is identified before he goes down a path of destruction? Where do you see your ideas on that?
I think those are absolutely important parts of the conversation that we have to have nationally, because I can tell you that I'm not in favor of simply having the teacher come to the principal's office to pick up their firearm. That is not the solution, right? We need teachers that are properly trained. There's something that happens, and you can ask military folks, you can ask law enforcement folks. There's something that happens to the human body, to the human mind, when you are put under the stress of a gunfight, right? Your vision narrows, the adrenaline begins to flow, your body begins to react to all of that. The last thing that we want is for people that are not skilled in using a firearm to start popping off shots in a crowded school or in a shopping center or wherever that might be, thinking they're doing the right thing and inadvertently cause harm that is totally unintended. So in terms of arming teachers, it's got to be teachers that volunteer. It's got to be teachers that are trained, I believe, to do that, to take up that role. And it's got to be training that is ongoing, not just one time and then you walk around with that gun on your hip. So some of these are important things. Now, where the teachers themselves are concerned, I've talked to several teachers since the Parkland shooting occurred, and at least every one of those teachers have said to me, Bill, if they would ask teachers, we can tell you who the children are, who the students are that are most likely to carry out these kinds of things. We get to know these kids on a very intimate level. And so that's part of the discussion too. How do we exercise that see something, say something, and protect the rights of privacy and the rights of individual freedom and liberties of our people, of our students? How do we do that? That's got to be part of the cultural discussion that we have.
I wanted to close with a theme of discussion. One of the things we reported on you and on your constituency was this hashtag release the memo. And I wanted to mention it because we reported on it strictly on social media, seeing it was one of the most engaged things you had on your social media, mainly
Right.
Twitter, with that hashtag. And I think we unwittingly participated, at least according to some analysis, that this was pumped up, amped up a little bit by some Russian influence, some Russian bots saying that this is something that they were willing to needle for a partisan thing. The NEWS memo, as it was called, was released with much fanfare. The Democratic memo, I think, was released a week and a half ago, 2 weeks, with not as much attention. But what were you seeing when you were reading in those committees, reading that memo, why you felt it important to release that or push for its release, knowing that some of this analysis, at least the amp up of this, was a little bit influenced by some Russian actors?
Well, I think it's important for the American people to have confidence, trust, and good faith in the federal government's ability to execute and oversee the laws that are put in place and to guarantee the rights of the individual citizen. And I think the American people absolutely need to be informed about this particular incident where a phony created document called the dossier was created and paid for by a political organization for the purposes of undermining another political party in our country, and then that document was used by the highest law enforcement agency in our country to get a warrant to spy and to survey individuals from a political party campaign. I don't care which political party you come from. That should not be tolerated in America. Our political system is supposed to be a trustworthy system. And if we've got members of the federal government using their position to undermine that, it's something the American people need to know about. And I am a big believer that these investigations are going to result in some accountability of FBI officials potentially. I do not sit on the Intel Committee, so when I say this, I don't know specific people that are going to be held accountable, but I can tell you that what happened was absolutely wrong. I've got a big question about what was told to that FISA judge. What was actually said? There's got to be a transcript somewhere of the hearing where that judge issued that warrant. What did the judge know, and when did the judge know it in terms of issuing that FISA warrant? So these are things that have to come out, and that's Congress's responsibility in its oversight position. We're not a law enforcement agency. I get asked all the time. In fact, I was asked last night, why, in light of all of this potential abuse, why hasn't someone at the FBI yet been fired? Congress is not a law enforcement agency. We are not judge and jury. We are an overseeing agency. Our job is to oversee the executive branch and the judicial branch, by the way, and hold them accountable for their role in complying with the Constitution. So our job is to expose these things, these abuses to the American people, and then demand that those that are responsible for investigating them do so with rigor and with trust and confidence of the American people.
Let me clarify if I'm understanding you correctly, and clarify for our viewers. When the criticism then, is it how the FBI has approached this? Does the end justify the means? Meaning, was it wrong for the so-called dossier to be formed by the partisan committee that paid for the committees that paid for it, or should the FBI not look at any evidence? Meaning, should the FBI ignore any evidence that they considered to be credible
Sure.
to lead them where other problems may lie, or was it just the problem that this dossier was used at all as a point of investigation?
A phony developed dossier, which that was, never verified. In fact, Director Comey told the president that it had never been verified. That's the operative word, that it has been verified as being factual, as being true, right? It had never been verified. And that dossier and the use of that dossier, when it's our understanding, and you saw it in the memos presented to that FISA judge, that judge was never told that it was a phony political dossier that had been bought and paid for by the other political party. According to the memos, that's what we've learned. And the Democrat memo pretty much says the same thing. It corroborates that part of the story. And so we can't have the federal government or one political party, when they are in power in the White House, using the power of the administration to spy on another political party. that undermines the very credibility of we the people, our representative form of government. We can't allow that to happen. And I'm looking forward to seeing these investigations play out.
I guess lastly to that, have you been assured, comforted, or by any means reassured that how the FBI has responded to this? Their response to these memos has been minimal, but your trust in the FBI overall as an agency to stay objective, to stay nonpartisan when these types of investigations are carried out, do you trust them to carry that out?
I'm glad you asked that question, because the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in America. And I don't have a question, and I'm loosely quoting Trey Gowdy here. I don't have a question about the patriotism and the desire of those people that work down at the investigative level within the FBI in doing their jobs, right? I think that they bleed red, white, and blue just like I do, and I think they want to do the right thing. The problem we've got here are political appointees, not the people down within the bowels of the FBI. I have great confidence in our Federal Bureau of Investigation.
As we close, thank you, Congressman Johnson, for joining us. When you head back to D.C., what's going to be on your priority list amid all these emergent issues? We've covered a lot of ground, but what's on your radar over the next couple weeks as you head back to Washington?
Broadband internet access, working that heavily. Infrastructure, water system, sewer system, roads and bridges here in eastern and southeastern Ohio, that's a big topic of conversation. LNG exports. We've got a bunch of liquid natural gas here in Ohio. Let's bring those jobs here to capture that resource, put us in play on the international stage, giving us great geopolitical leverage with countries like Russia, Iran, China, and others. National security, making sure that we have the tools in our military, the planes, the tanks, the bombs, the ships, and the money to train those people. Did you know we lost more people last year, 4 times as many, in fact, in training accidents in our Department of Defense than were killed in combat? Yeah. That's because of the lack of funding and the lack of the right kind of funding to rebuild our military. We got planes sitting on the ramp that can't fly. We've got pilots that can't put fuel in their airplanes to get training. We've got Navy captains out in the ocean that can't exercise and train because of lack of resources. We've got to fix all of that because we're the greatest military on the planet. We're the greatest nation on the planet, and there are those that want to do us harm. Russia, Iran, China, just to name a few. So infrastructure, national security, economic growth, our energy resources, those are the top ticket items that I'm concerned about.
We'll be watching, we'll be listening to you on the Hill, and we welcome you back when you visit us again here in the Ohio Valley.
All right, thank you very much. Good to be with you today.